Hi everyone, my name is Abrielle Hamilton and I am on the Climate Smart Communities Board for the town of Stanfordville. And today we're going to talk to you a little bit about the program and where we are as a town.
And hello everybody, my name is Nate Kimball. I'm also on the Climate Smart Task Force. Thanks for joining and listening along today while we talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing.
In 2022, Stanford opted into the New York State Climate Smart Communities program, and in 2023, a Climate Smart Communities task force was chosen to move this work forward and collaborate with town stakeholders. We are excited to share and receive feedback on our vision and build resiliency for the residents and businesses in Stanford.
As many of you may know, the costs of severe weather are increasing around the globe. On a CPI adjusted basis, annual costs due to extreme weather have almost tripled in the United States over the last 40 years. The average cost in billions of dollars over the last approximately 5 years has been over $157 billion a year. So these are impacts that we can't ignore no matter where we are in the United States or the globe. The number of events are also increasing, putting increased stress on emergency managers and on town management across the country.
So, realizing that this was kind of an issue, New York State decided to create a program to start to help communities overcome some of these challenges, and that is the Climate Smart Communities program. It helps local governments take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the changing climate. The program offers grants, rebates for electric vehicles, and free technical assistance. The program provides tools and templates to help communities build resiliency and connect with state programs to assist in times of need. So, why should we, as the town of Stanford, participate? Like many communities around New York State, Stanford has experienced impacts from extreme weather in recent years, including power outages and winter storms, air quality and smoke impacts in the summer of 2023, and many more. We believe it is critical to improve our community's resiliency against these impacts while reducing our own environmental footprint and managing long-term costs.
One impact we're particularly attuned to over the course of this summer of 2024 is extreme heat. We know that extreme heat is a major issue, especially for aging and other health vulnerable populations, and it's something that we intend to address as we move forward. We've identified some proposed basic principles or values that we think could fit well in the town of Stanford as we think about how to design a climate smart program, and we welcome feedback on these. The first is building resiliency, helping our community bounce back quickly from the impacts of the shocks and stresses that we've been experiencing over the last few years and expect to experience in the future. We want to do that while investing in our economy. There are a lot of climate smart opportunities that can bring jobs to the community, including investing in renewable energy, electric vehicle infrastructure, and more. And we want to reduce costs for our town. So climate change is imposing costs on the country and towns at large, and we want to reduce the environmental impact of our operations while building resiliency in our infrastructure. We can also drive some revenue to the town by investing in energy and waste infrastructure while preserving the natural resources of Stanford and of Dutchess County.
So the Climate Smart Community Certification process has a few steps. The first step is to register as a community that's interested in being part of the Climate Smart Communities program. So we have done that, and kind of within that, the first step that we needed to take was to create our Climate Smart Communities Task Force, which we have also done. And then the next major step is to undertake mandatory and voluntary actions within the certification framework. And then when we've taken those actions, we can, put all of our paperwork together, get all of our ducks in a row, and submit a certification. We're currently in the process of collecting our paperwork and getting our ducks in a row to submit for certification. And then once we submit for certification and get certified, the community can begin to benefit from the certification, especially in the form of kind of getting special consideration for grants or having access to special grants just for climate smart certified communities.
The really nice part about this program is that it has the flexibility to allow us to pursue a pathway that really makes sense for Stanford. It's not a one-size-fits-all program, and you wouldn't expect it to be because we aren't Schenectady, we aren't New York City. And so we want to define our own values and pursue the certification actions that make sense for us. But the nice piece of certifying is that we do get special consideration for state grant programs, which could really help us out.
Our task force is currently made up of a number of different people. Teddy Secor is our committee chair. I'm Abrielle, you already met me, I'm the committee co-chair. Dennis is our secretary, and then Nate, Michelle, and Tracy provide invaluable support as members on the board as well. We have support from Anna Herod McGrew from the Hudson River Estuary Program, and Wendy Burton also provides insight and support when possible.
We are constantly seeking support and input from additional members of the community, so we'll have some contact information at the end of this presentation if you'd like to reach out and provide support as well. So first off, what is a greenhouse gas inventory and why is it important? All organizations, towns, corporations, individuals can understand the greenhouse gas impact of the activities that they take place in every day. Greenhouse gases, of course, contribute to global warming, and if we do not reduce our greenhouse gas emissions over the next 10 to 20 years, the runaway impacts of climate change could be devastating to communities like ours in the form of extreme heat and drought and other impacts that we'll get into a little bit later. So the first way to understand how to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions is, of course, to measure them. So we are measuring what are called our scope 1 and 2 or direct emissions within our operational control. And these are the emissions within the control of our municipal operations, so everything that's controlled by the town. Scope 1 emissions are direct fuel burn. So that's everything from the boilers in our buildings to the diesel and gas engines in our vehicles. Scope 2 emissions are directly controlled emissions, but they're from electricity use. So the actual emissions associated with that electricity use take place elsewhere. So that's why it's called Scope 2 or indirect. Scope 3 emissions are, we did not account for, at least not yet. Those are all the indirect emissions that you don't have direct control over. So things like the items that the town purchases over the course of regular operations, employee commuting, employee travel, that type of thing. So we may measure those emissions in the future, but we wanted to start with the things that we can directly influence and control. So our emissions inventory includes all the buildings that the town operates, so town hall, the highway department garage, the rec, and our streetlights, and all of the gasoline and diesel usage associated with our fleet vehicles. So it may not be a huge surprise that given our extensive operations from the highway department and snow clearing and all of the really important activities taking place in town, that vehicles constitute over 90% of our greenhouse gas emissions. This is over the course of 2021 and 2022. So essentially it's a pretty simple formula where we measure the gasoline and diesel usage. There's a conversion factor to metric tons of CO2 equivalents. So that's CO2 and then all the constituent gases like methane that also contribute to global warming, all bundled up into one number. And you can see that there's some variation year over year. That's really due to the fact that we may have a more severe winter one year than another. We may pave more roads one year than another. So not stuff that we would directly want to influence, but just good data to have as we start to think about how to manage these emissions. And you can see that our building energy consumption is largely driven by number 2 fuel oil used for heating. So that's a definite opportunity that we can use to potentially drive down emissions in the future. And our electricity use is a pretty small number. You can see it's a little over 5 metric tons CO2 equivalents in 2021 and under 5 in 2022. That's largely due to the fact that the grid in New York State overall is getting greener. And as it gets greener, those emissions will continue to go down. So how do we use this data? It's, we obviously are not going to propose reducing or curtailing any operations that the town is taking place in, because we just it's very important that we maintain our operations in winter, that we maintain our road construction operations, and so we start to think about how we might influence fuel usage while maintaining all the activities that are really important to sustain the economic activity in our town. So, the first piece is to do a little bit more analysis to understand why our fuel usage fluctuates to the level that it does year over year, and determine whether there are some cost management strategies or fleet optimization strategies that we can do to gain some efficiencies in the way that we're working. The other piece is, of course, electrification. So as the grid gets greener, it makes sense to electrify both pieces of equipment that can be electrified in a cost-effective manner and the heating sources that we use for our building heat. As many of you may know, heat pumps are getting more and more efficient, more and more cost-effective year over year, and so it's a worthwhile endeavor to look into whether we could move towards heat pumps for certain heating operations within town operations. So we believe that there's an opportunity to do some cost-benefit analysis around electrifying certain types of equipment. Obviously, not all heavy vehicles can be electrified yet, at least not cost-effectively. So we're going to be assessing that moving forward. The third and final option would be looking into options like renewable diesel procurement. So renewable diesel is a type of fuel that's chemically indistinguishable from traditional fossil diesel, but it's made from bio-based sources. Often those bio-based sources have significantly lower emissions than fossil fuels, and sometimes the renewable diesel can be procured at relatively cost competitive levels. So we will be looking into that as well. And of course, we solicit feedback from community members as you have additional ideas about how we might gain some cost competitiveness and reduce emissions across town operations. The second piece of work that we did was a climate vulnerability assessment, and our camera got weird again. Sorry about that. We wanted to understand the sources of potential shocks and stresses that we might see in the town going forward and how we might manage those. So first off, what is a climate vulnerability assessment? It's looking at our current and future vulnerability to hazards as to the town as a whole, and also to critical infrastructure that we identified in partnership with Wendy and other folks within town government. So in terms of the critical infrastructure inventory in Stanfordville, we proposed a list that includes what you see here. So roads, agricultural land, our fire company facility, of course, the highway facility, town hall, our transfer station, the Central Hudson facility on Hunts Lake Road, which has really critical operational capacity during those shocks and stresses, and of course our housing infrastructure. We would love some input on whether this is a complete list and what other types of infrastructure we might want to consider adding to this list as we update the vulnerability assessment. We also wanted to zero in on the climate hazards that this town is exposed to. And so we identified how many is that? 6 hazards that we wanted to focus on. So flooding from extreme rain is obviously becoming more and more of a consideration. You may see your basements getting wetter year over year. I certainly see mine getting wetter. Extreme heat is, of course, a primary health-based consideration. Wind damage, that we see a lot of wind damage coming in when there's a major coastal storm, even though we're not all that close to the coast. of course, cold snaps and ice storms can have impacts both on our road infrastructure as well as on our power grid. We do see tornadoes from time to time, and then finally riverine flooding, so flooding when our rivers get too high. So we focused on these hazards, and we started to zero in on the impacts that some of these hazards might have. We consulted a number of data sources, so there are a lot of really good data sources to identify your community's risk profile, and one of them is the FEMA National Risk Index. It essentially indexes hazards by census tract, so it's pretty precise, and it gives you data on how exposed your community might be to that risk, and I'll show you what it gave us when we put our community's data into the risk index. We also, for heat, consulted the New York State Department of Health Heat Vulnerability Index. And that index essentially takes a number of variables together that assess whether a community might have populations at risk to extreme heat events. And that includes language vulnerability, so populations that may not understand instructions coming through on their phones from emergency services that are only in English, socioeconomic vulnerability, and things like environmental and urban vulnerability, as well as elderly isolation, so percentage of population that is 65 years of older and living alone. So starting with the FEMA National Risk Index, we have one census tract in town, so it was a pretty easy assessment to do. And what's really nice about the index is that it gives you a ton of data about not just the hazards that we focused on, but every hazard that we might be exposed to. What it does is it looks at the historical records of different hazards. So, for example, if we look at hurricanes, there are 7 events on record from 1850 to 2021, and they develop an expected annual loss number, and this is based on a number of economic variables that go into their model, but also the impacts that those historical hazards have. It's not perfect because this is not forward-looking, so we know that the impacts are going to increase over time. But, as a historical record, it's a pretty good assessment of the relative risk associated with each of these hazards. So you see that, hurricanes have had major impacts in Stanford over the years. And what's interesting is that tornadoes have as well. There are only 2 events on record, but the damage that was associated with those tornadoes was pretty significant. And where there are no events on record, like for wildfires, FEMA makes an estimate of the relative risk of wildfires happening in a community and then what the impacts to that community might be. And while that may seem to be an improbable risk, we saw a lot of wildfires last year up in Quebec. We saw some in New Jersey earlier this year, so it's not out of the realm of possibility during periods of drought. We will provide these slides after the presentation so that you can dig into this data a little bit more. So what does this all mean? What we found is that there are a number of potential impacts by hazard. So, of course, riverine flooding. When rivers flood, it impacts bridges, it impacts transportation. And we have a number of bridges that are in the 100-year flood zone here in Stanford. So that includes the bridges over Gristmill Lane, Salt Point Turnpike, Bull's Head Road, Route 82, Cold Spring, Stissing, Depot Lane, Creamery Road, and Jameson Hill Road. So those would all need to be monitored. If you see a lot of impacts, a lot of riverine flooding impacts, that of course weakens supports to bridges and reduces their expected lifespan, increasing the costs on the town. Extreme rain is a threat both to our roads, of course, but also to agriculture. Extreme rain events can damage crops, and they can impact the ability for our farms to productively and profitably operate. Heat is a really significant impact for not just us, but almost every community in the United States is starting to experience impacts from extreme heat, and it is the most deadly hazard. So this is something that we want to look into a lot more closely with town management and understand how we might better serve the population during periods of heat stress. Of course, roads can be impacted from heat. There can be asphalt buckling. Asphalt can fail prematurely. Of course, the most deadly impact is from houses that are unair conditioned and vulnerable populations. A lot of times people don't know that they're experiencing heat stress, and that's the most dangerous time, is when you may not think that you need air conditioning, but you do. So even a couple hours a day of exposure to air conditioning during a period of heat can help the body cool down and regulate itself. Also, heat causes impacts on electrical infrastructure in the grid. So that can lead to electrical fires, increases the potential for power loss, and impacts on the fire company. Tornadoes and wind damage can obviously cause impacts that may happen more frequently in the future. And then ice storms and cold snaps are interesting because you wouldn't associate these normally with climate change or global warming, but we do see a lot more temperature variability than we did in the past. So if it's really warm and then it turns really cold, that can be a danger sign for infrastructure. This is a really busy slide, and what it essentially attempts to explain is that depending on what we do to reduce our global emissions, we're going to see a range of impacts in the future. So there's a green scenario, which means that we're really significantly reducing global emissions, keeping global warming below certain levels. We're still going to see impacts, right? The town will still experience increased impacts to what it experiences today, and we need to plan for that. But if we do not reduce global emissions, if we continue a business as usual scenario, we'll start to see really extreme impacts. So if you look at extreme heat, for example, we'll see almost a 10-time intensity change in terms of the frequency of heat waves. That means that we may see up to 10 times as many days over 90 degrees as we do today. So that's a really potential significant impact that could lead to really significant health concerns in our population. Again, we'll make these slides available to everyone afterwards. But the two slides that our faces are the two impacts that our faces are blocking below are tornadoes and droughts. And this is really something that we need to be cognizant of. A lot of us are on well water, so we need to be thinking about what backup water supply might look like in periods of extreme drought. We have seen some of our neighbors' wells going dry in past years when we had extreme droughts. So what do we do? There's a lot of different avenues that we can take. It's definitely a large challenge that the town needs to take on, but we need to think about some of the nuts and bolts about how we protect our critical infrastructure. We need backup power. There needs to be a way to power our critical infrastructure, like the fire company, like the highway garage, when there are power outages that last for a long time. And also powering cooling centers. We need to maintain the availability of air conditioning for our vulnerable populations, even if the town is without power. One action would be just coordinating more closely with the DOT, New York State DOT, to make sure that when we rebuild a bridge, it's designed for extreme heat and extreme rain. There are New York State grants available for backup power, battery backups, emergency kits that we will start looking into. And there's also an emergency management angle where we need to start thinking about a broader range of hazards that we train for. So finally, we want to make sure that we're putting programs in place that provide outreach to senior citizens to make sure that they have information about cooling and heating centers when there are these periods of extreme weather. Hand it over. So Dennis is our intrepid secretary who can to manage any communication-related matters, but also, most importantly, as you have questions and recommendations, comments for the group, you can send them to Dennis, and we'd love to see you at a meeting. I think it's really important to get as many people involved in this as possible. We are not by any means the experts on emergency management in town or municipal operations or road operations. And so we want to get those experts involved. We want to hear from everybody on what some ideas might be to build resiliency in the town of Stanford. So thank you for listening.
Thank you.